In 1584, the Dutch city of Delft was the location of a momentous political event, the assassination of William the Silent, Prince of Orange, and leader of Dutch resistance to Spanish rule. Within years, the Dutch United Provinces were free of Spanish domination. Protestant Holland now entered a golden age of freedom and wealth, with the citizens of Delft sharing this prosperity. Like other Dutch cities at that time, Delft was also known for its thriving art market, and in 1631, a local innkeeper became one of Delft's official art dealers. His name was Reinier Janzoen. The following year, he became father to Delft's most famous artist, Jan Vermeer.
Vermeer produced some of the most singular and individual works of the whole of the 17th century. His works are marked by intimacy, mood, and luminosity. I think there's always a sense of mystery in Vermeer as well. It's I think, with good reason that he's called the Sphinx of Delft.
Vermeer's work, its sensitivity to effects of light on things like glass, on the plain white plastered surface of a wall, where you can just get the faintest tinge of a blue hue, for example. It's as though Vermeer is trying to forget what he knows he's seeing and see without preconceptions.
Vermeer is one of the very greatest painters of the Dutch tradition. This is the everyday raised to an extraordinary level of poetry. I mean, that's what Vermeer is in a sense all about.
Of all the great artists of history, Vermeer is amongst the most mysterious. We have no idea what he looked like, and details of his life are scarce. Only 36 paintings can be definitely attributed to Vermeer, and his work was virtually unknown for 2 centuries after his death.
He was the son of an innkeeper and art dealer, so it's clear that he was surrounded by art all of his life. He also had something of a reputation for being a specialist, an expert on Italian art. One of his very few recorded visits outside of Delft came in 1670 when he went to The Hague to judge as an expert in a dispute between the authenticity of some Italian paintings.
He was probably influenced by the Utrecht Caravagisti, the people who came back from Italy and brought back this Roman style. He certainly owned some paintings by Utrecht Caravagesque painters, such as a painting by Dirk van Baburen that appears in the background of, I think, 2 of his paintings.
In the 1640s, Delft was the location for a distinctive school of art. Delft painters such as Karel Fabricius were noted for their interest in perspective and their emphasis on the effects of light and color. Ultimately, it would be this local approach that would most influence Vermeer's work.
The earliest paintings by Vermeer are large-scale paintings of religious and mythological subjects. The Christ in the House of Martha and Mary and Diana and Her Companions, which is in The Hague. The picture in The Hague, of course, has to be judged very carefully because it is a damaged picture. In the sense, the surface of the picture is not the surface as Vermeer left it. However, looking at those 2 pictures, I think what is clear is that they lack narrative drive. I mean, this is not the natural language of Vermeer.
Both these canvases were completed in 1655, but these early works only serve to add to the mystery of Vermeer's artistic development. They differ profoundly from the kind of work he produced later in his career.
Vermeer's first known mythological painting is Diana and Her Companions. And he gives us a very unusual rendition of it, because usually Diana is an opportunity for flesh. Unusually, Vermeer gives us a very sober and clothed version of this. Instead of displaying herself, Diana is actually having her feet bathed.
Christ in the House of Martha and Mary is a canvas roughly 1.5 meters square and is 10 times the size of many of Vermeer's later paintings. The significance of these early paintings lies in the artistic approaches that influenced Vermeer. At that time, the Dutch city of Utrecht was home to a school of painting that adopted the styles of Italian masters such as the great Caravaggio.
Caravagesque painters were conditioned by the Italian concept of history painting, of paintings that related to texts like the Bible. And the early works show that he had ambitions to work in that genre. What seems to happen later on, from about 1655 onwards, is that he abandons the outer form of that historical allegory, these moral exemplar, and tries to get at the same ideas through scenes of everyday life.
Italian influence can also be seen in Saint Praxedes, a religious image only recently accepted as being the work of Vermeer.
St. Praxedes was a Roman saint. She was canonised because she helped in the burial of early Christian martyrs. And you can see in the front of the painting there's a chalice. She's leaning over with a sponge. The sponge has been used to clean decapitated Christian martyrs.
In 1656, Vermeer painted the Procuress, his only canvas to be authentically signed and dated. Again, this is a large work depicting a scene in a 17th century Dutch brothel. The strong colors and thick impasto of the Procuress also indicate Italian influence. But this painting offers hints of what would become Vermeer's unique artistic approach. This is the point when he adopted the contemporary subject matter that would characterize his life's work. This is The Girl Pouring Milk. Painted around 1660, it is perhaps the most famous Vermeer of them all, and virtually every feature of the canvas characterizes the artist's mature body of work.
She is the Dutch maid as a symbol of the Netherlands, from the Virgin Mary, and the Dutch maid was a secularization of that. The Netherlands was still, and is now, associated with the production of dairy produce. A feminine figure pouring from a jug was a figure of virtue.
The monumentality of this very small picture and the monumentality of the figure, almost heroicization of the everyday. I mean, that's what these genre painters in the Netherlands do, and this is what Vermeer does above all.
Vermeer is this great painter of light. But what we get in Vermeer's paintings, we don't get harsh outlines. The way the light comes through very subtly models, so we get a slightly blurred image. X-rays of this painting show that originally there was a painting on the back wall, but I think quite rightly Vermeer removes this. It would have been a strange inclusion in a kitchen interior. And by using a plain back wall as well, you have all the possibilities of light falling on bare plaster.
At the time, many artists chose to paint on wooden panels, but for virtually the whole of his career, Vermeer chose canvas as the surface for all his works. We only know of 30 Vermeer paintings, a small number which cannot be solely explained by losses over the centuries. Despite Vermeer's limited output, his paintings succeed in capturing all aspects of the feminine character. Female care and attention to the task in hand can also be seen in Woman Holding a Balance, a canvas from around 1664, which has also been seen as a symbol of temperate virtue.
For a long time it was called both a woman weighing gold and a woman weighing pearls, but microscopic analysis has shown that the pans of the scales don't contain anything. The meaning of the painting is added to by what's going on in the background. There's a painting of the Last Judgment.
The fact that there's a balance in the foreground and the fact that the Last Judgment is, the weighing of souls. I mean, I don't think that would have escaped Vermeer. But I think this is more a sort of witty reference. It's more a subtle and clever reference than it is some tremendously heavy-going symbolic argument.
Vermeer's women are not always paragons of virtue. His depiction of the Procuress reveals the artist's early identification of the other side of the female character. The girl with the wine glass is also far from being a depiction of goodness. There is little doubt that this young woman is already experiencing the effects of the alcohol being offered by this unsubtle suitor. With this 1657 canvas, Girl Sleeping, the message is even clearer. Temperance is certainly not the subject matter of this canvas, which is also notable for the marvelously textured Oriental rug. This is a device which Vermeer had already used in the Procuress, and which would often appear in his later works. But in most of Vermeer's images of women, we are not presented with either idolized virtue or moral fecklessness. Instead, we see female figures in ordinary, everyday scenes. This image of a woman with a water jug is typical.
Vermeer does have a remarkable insight into an idea of womanhood. It's not womanhood as perceived by women from a womanly position, but actually women as a projection of men's desire, as a kind of muse or a personification that can elevate the masculine position to a kind of state of spiritual desire. I do think it's worth imagining these women not as, for example, Vermeer's wife or his daughter or his mistress or his maid or whatever, actual people, but as kind of allegorical figures.
Many of Vermeer's finest images of women convey a strong sense of silence and are almost studious in nature. This calm, meditative sensation can even be detected in the Vermeer canvases depicting women with musical instruments.
Music is very often associated with love, and of course, just like letters can bring tokens of love, music can be associated with love as well. We also often get men included in this musical element. So these might be teachers of music, but they might also be used to introduce a kind of flirtatious note.
In this canvas from the mid-1600s, we can immediately recognize the artist's mastery of light, even though the painting has survived the centuries in a poor state of repair. Few artists of history have handled light with the genius of Jan Vermeer.
There was a community of interest in these effects among artists in Delft, and they were all interested in studying these effects. Of course, Vermeer is by far the greatest of all these. I mean, he really is able to render light in the most subtle and clever manner. He uses the pigments that everybody had in their palette. I mean, he just, to put it very simply, does it better.
The reason for the window on the left is, I think, very practical. Most painters are right-handed, so you set an easel up and you have the light coming in from the left, so your right hand isn't masking your work and shadowing it as you paint it. And you can see exactly this going on in Vermeer's own painting of the artist in his studio, or the allegory of painting as it's sometimes called.
Vermeer's fondness for musical instruments is reflected in many of his best-known works. In this painting, the detail and warm coloring of the cello are matched by a skillful depiction of the keyboard instrument known as the virginals. There is a mathematical sense of order influencing this rendition of physical space, which is unsurprising as Delft's artists maintained a strong interest in the techniques of perspective. Vermeer entered into this tradition with a passion.
Around about 1650, a group of artists came together who seem to have been interested in recreating the optical, visual effects of light on the retina, and this came out both in perspectival distortions and the effects of light and space and the mathematics, if you like, of vision. It's something that's evolving from a northern tradition, a northern pictorial tradition, something like the Aichian interest in mirroring the world. But it's blending with and merging into what we might see as an Enlightenment interest in a kind of detached, objective concept of vision, and that crystallises around the issue of Vermeer's use of the camera obscura.
The camera obscura was an early optical device. It was basically a box with a lens and a slanted mirror. So an image would go in through the lens and it would be diverted by the slanted mirror to create a smaller reversed image of the original image. So it's been suggested that Vermeer used this and traced these to get his perspectival arrangements. In certain of Vermeer's paintings, the use of a camera obscura is suggested because we get the details of very intense colour. We also get effects in the foreground that make foreground figures look bigger. And of course, in the painting The Soldier and the Laughing Girl, we have this enormous soldier sitting in the foreground. The camera obscura, when it reflects onto a shiny or a polished object, gives you these little beads of light. And that's another element that's very characteristic of Vermeer's paintings. You get these little raised elements of light paint, quite heavily impasted.
Whether he actually used a camera obscura in the sense of looking through it and setting up his subjects and then looking through it and transferring somehow the camera obscura image to his canvases, I'm kind of doubtful. I just think he knew what that looked like. And if one thinks of a camera as providing an objective experience of the world, which lots of people do, that it's a true record or something like that, then again, one can equate this with science.
Vermeer's technique was remarkable. Repeatedly, he incorporates a diagonal checkerboard tile floor to accentuate the sense of space within the canvas. This can be seen in one of his later works, The Love Letter from 1669. Here it is the female that provides what is, for Vermeer, an intriguingly narrative human element. The exchanged glances between the lady of the house and her maid urge the viewer to imagine the contents of the letter. But from an artistic point of view, this canvas is a triumph of perspective, with the curtain pulled away to let us into a three-dimensional world in which every object contributes to the overall effect.
In a number of Vermeer's paintings, as a spectator, we're gently seeing what's unfolding in front of us. If you like, we're a privileged viewer. In some of the paintings as well, there's a chair in the foreground. Again, we're being invited in.
Vermeer's works are famous for their paintings within paintings, and it is unlikely that his choice of subject matter was accidental. In the painting of the woman holding a balance, the fact that the lady is standing in front of an image of the Last Judgment can hardly be meaningless. There is a contrast between the physical, material world of precious metals and jewels and the eternal, spiritual world. In this later work depicting a lady playing the virginals, Vermeer uses the painting within a painting idea to illustrate the concept of love by depicting Cupid. To this day, Vermeer's purpose is still debated.
Objects that seem to have a perfectly rightful place within the composition can be seen at a closer look or at another look to have connotations and resonances that refer to abstract things rather than just being a simple depiction of the interior. And a very obvious example of that is paintings within the painting. The subject matter of the painting within the painting may comment on the subject matter of what's going on in the painting, as it were.
The great example is the Procuress, this painting by Baburen, which hangs in the background of the girl with the virginal. Because it shows a procuress, does that make her a prostitute? I think this is most unlikely. I think this is just undecorous. I don't think this is really what happened in the 17th century. I think that picture is there because we know that he owned this picture.
It occurs in one of them called The Concert, where you have a single man and two females. And of course, by introducing this element of sexuality into it, it might intimate that this threesome is going to degenerate into something else. Now, the virginal was the instrument that was called the virginal because it was appropriate for young women to play. So I think in this instance, the inclusion of the painting wasn't meant to suggest anything the girl was going to do. It was actually a contrast between, if you like, one way of life and the simple, pure, maidenly way of life that this girl follows.
Many students of Vermeer are also fascinated by the artist's enthusiasm for depicting maps in many of his finest canvases. This early painting is a classic example. It is typically Vermeer in its perspectival layout and in its handling of light. Its subject matter is also familiar, a cheerful woman in conversation with a soldier, whose body language suggests that his intentions are not entirely platonic. But the viewer cannot help but be drawn to the map shown in the background. Although it is shown tilted through 90 degrees in the fashion of the time, we can recognize this as a map of Vermeer's home country.
Are they patriotic symbols? Do they refer to the tradition of Netherlandish painting? Are they about travel or about knowledge of the world? Nobody is ever going to know. I think if he did write an I intended, it would be I intended to allow you to think about this and to think about what this might mean and to enrich, to produce a very, very rich semantic kind of experience for viewers. They are deeply symbolic, the paintings, I think, but not simply symbolic.
Map making was an important profession. and in one of the few Vermeer canvases to feature an individual male, the artist captures the high status of the geographer. This is an image of science, an image of the age of reason and measurements, an image which shows man as the master of his planet. This sense of reverence for science can also be seen in The Astronomer, a canvas usually bracketed with the geographer. This is another confident image of Vermeer's time, a subtly lit scene in which the relationship between humanity and Earth is made clear. Knowledge is the key to this relationship, here visually represented in the text material on the table. It is possible that the figure shown here was a real man of science. Indeed, he may be none other than Antony van Leeuwenhoek, the inventor of the microscope. It was a fertile period of artistic activity, and artists like de Hoek often chose to paint the city that formed the center of this artistic golden age. On 2 occasions, Vermeer also traveled outside Delft to depict the city on canvas. On the second of these occasions, the result was simply astounding. The unrivaled master of the interior scene created a landscape regarded by many as the greatest ever created. But Vermeer's first outdoor artistic expedition was also remarkable.
Het Straatje, the little street, the painting in the Rijksmuseum, is, of course, one of the most outstanding magical works by Vermeer. I mean, it has often been described as photographic, and it was described as such, of course, in the late 19th century. It's because it sort of takes an apparently random street scene, and this may well have been the view from Vermeer's actual house in Delft. I mean, looking out of his studio window to the street at the back.
Here it is the color and texture which takes center stage, especially in the brickwork and the wooden window shutters.
Vermeer's always playing with what is a picture. He often shows reflections on window panes. He's playing with the idea of these rectangular surfaces, and if you look at something like the little street, it's not just windows, it's doors and buildings, and all these rectangles all the time. In the Italian tradition, a painting was a window onto another world. This is a crucial definition of painting for the Italian Renaissance, the idea that you're looking through something transparent to another world.
But although this is a townscape scene, Vermeer does not eliminate the human element from the canvas. The individuals depicted going about their day's business also have a role to play in this scene.
It does come over as a very quiet scene indeed. We've got just 3 little groups of human characters. There's a woman making lace in the door, there's another housewife through a doorway, and there are some children as well. I think it's intriguing that this is just about the only image that Vermeer paints of children. And after all, his wife did have 11 children, and it's often been speculated, why are there so few children in Vermeer's works? It seems to me he might have had enough of them at home and not included them in his art.
Small human figures can also be seen in the second and the greatest of Vermeer's outdoor scenes, his 1661 View of Delft. An unusually large work, this painting is over 1 meter square and inspired the greatest landscapists. It shows the city of Delft on an early evening when sunshine and cloud are jostling for dominance in the milky Netherlands sky. But the human element is not left behind. In the foreground, we see a number of citizens discussing the concerns of the day. This is one of the features making this such a masterpiece.
The View of Delft is one of the greatest masterpieces of Western art. The scale, of course, is quite remarkable to paint for Vermeer himself and for this type of town view. The way that he distinguishes the texture of the river, the riverbank, the sky, and of course this extraordinary town view. He indicates recession by using tonality, by using color. I mean, that's how the picture recedes.
Vermeer managed to avoid bankruptcy in his lifetime, but it is clear that he experienced serious money troubles. Some students of Vermeer have suggested that this 1667 canvas is indicative of the Vermeer family's problems at the time. Could this be Catherine receiving grim financial news from her maid? We cannot be sure. All that we do know is that following Vermeer's death in 1675, his widow was left with crippling financial burdens. But his final years also included two subtly different works. This is the Artist's Studio, another unusually large canvas.
The Artist's Studio is one of two allegories that Vermeer paints. So an allegory is the telling of one story by another story. So it's most likely that this is an allegory of painting. So what we've got is the artist seated at his easel, and he's looking at a female figure. This is the female figure of Clio, one of the muses of history. We can tell this because she's wearing a laurel crown, she's got a book of Greek history by the author Thucydides, and she's also got a trumpet, the trumpet of fame.
In this picture, he is using an allegorical language, which is different from the language he uses when representing ordinary domestic interiors. And yet, of course, there are elements within the picture space which are very familiar. I mean, the black and white tiles on the floor, the stool at which he sits, the easel, the way the light falls from the left in the way that it does in so many of his paintings. So it is an allegory placed in a space which is recognizable as his studio or room in his house.
He's dressed in Burgundian dress from the period when the Netherlands belonged to the Dukes of Burgundy. And in that way, I think that there's a self-conscious adherence to a tradition of painting that goes back to Jan van Eyck, who was a court painter to the Dukes of Burgundy.
Is this artist at work Vermeer himself? If this is Vermeer, it is our only image of him. Jan Vermeer's death was as mysterious as his life. He died on December 13, 1675, at the age of 42. In the final year of his life, Vermeer painted what was probably his last work, the Allegory of Faith.
Throughout the 18th and 19th century, Vermeer works are sold, but they don't attract very high prices. His rediscovery is down to a single person, a man called Théophile Torre Berger. In 1866, he wrote a series of 2 articles in the Gazette des Beaux-Arts in France, all about Vermeer.
Proust wrote this famous description of the view of Delft, and really Vermeer has been established since around about 1900 as one of the very great painters of the Western tradition.
Interest in Vermeer's work coincides with the popularisation of photography, so that a kind of imagery which allows the appreciation of the formal qualities of his work, and also with the emergence of Impressionism, a kind of art that is attempting to recreate a vision of the world without preconception.
He was a master of color, texture, and especially light. Perhaps no other artist in history has asserted his genius so triumphantly in such a limited body of work. And the mysteries of his life only add to the story of Jan Vermeer.